Good morning. I have the pleasure to welcome you. Actually, I don't need this.
Rich and
interesting day, I'm sure. Papers are organized, as you will see, in Rotman chronological order. We will start from Greek antiquity and make our way towards the medieval Mediterranean. Our first speaker, Professor Canevaro, is Professor of Greek History at the University of Edinburgh. He's a specialist classical Greek history and political thought. He has co-edited books 4 and then 7 and 8 of Aristotle's Politics. Before that, he wrote a dissertation on the documents in the Act of Orators, which came out in 2013. And that's the sort of the root of some shared interest of ours. His second book from 2016 is a commentary to the Muslim speech against the Athenians, which is the main ancient discussion of the honorific culture of the Athenian democracy. And he's now in the process of bringing to completion a very large research project funded by the EU on honor in ancient Greek culture. His paper today is titled "Were the Greek Races?" Some means of exclusion. Some reflections on categories and definitions. There's a handout that I tried to hand out to the best of my limited skills. There's some handouts that are left on the chair back there. And without further ado, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me?
Thank you very much, Nino. Thank you for the invitation and thanks to the foundation for having me here. I am particularly pleased to get a chance to get back home in a way, because although I'm not a native of Turin, I come from slightly further afield from Alessandria. I studied here. My formative year was here. And when I was young and when I started doing university here, I developed the strong belief that Turin was basically the center of the world. I have been around a bit since, and maybe confirmation bias, but very little has managed to disabuse me of that notion. I am still fundamentally convinced that Turin is the center of the world. And the initiatives like the Green Humanities Program, with its willingness to tackle big idea, to entertain the possibility of, let's test some hypotheses and the idea of history across periods, is the kind of creative initiative that once again confirms me in this notion. Turin does remain the center of the world, at least to me, but in general, I think. So I'll get started straight away, thanking the foundation and everyone. And I'll say that in a fashion typical of our long friendship, Nino decided to throw me in at the deep end and dictated the topic of my presentation today, rejecting any attempts to narrow down the question and referring it into a more defined historical problem that I could try to answer throwing sources at you, for example. I suggested my current title as a joke, and Nino instantly replied, "I'll use that." So here I am, trying to make sense of one of the thorniest issues in Greek history, starting from relative ignorance, because it is not what I normally work on. So I'll do my best, but if I say something preposterous, it's his fault. Okay? So, sifting through the historical scholarship on race and ethnicity is aimed at a moving target, as the topic is politically loaded, and historians of the past century and more have not by and large been talking about the same thing. Because most works stipulate the core categories differently, these agreements often reflect conceptual differences rather than interpretive ones. This stipulatory frenzy continues today. Recent discussions of race by Denise Mikowski, Rebecca Kennedy, and Sarah Bergy have little in common with Benjamin Isaac's 2004 take, just as 1929 thoughts of race feel incommensurable with more recent perspective. The result is that it's difficult to pinpoint precisely called convergences and disagreement because the underlying categories are different. The moving target of race, moreover, has affected its relation with the more popular concept of ethnicity. When race was considered bankrupt as a heuristic, ethnicity became, for a while, the only game in town, while more recently, even ethnicity has come under fire as moral respect for allegedly overlooking core issues without framed as moral issues. I'll attempt to bring some order to this concept of historiographical mess or so. In the limited time I have, I'll be by necessity very schematic, making position and implication look sharper than they really are. We can then nuance things later. The goal is to gain some clarity first and foremost for myself, but then perhaps somebody else may do. I hope so. So let's oversimplify then and sketch a beginning for our story. How did we speak of race and ethnicity before World War II? Both were understood as different determinisms. Race, as a biological category, was linked to physical features, which were held to be indicative of supposed intellectual, moral, and cultural traits. Pseudo-scientific racial theory fueled hierarchies that justified colonialism, slavery, and segregation. As for ethnicity, it was framed as a form of primordialism. It was viewed, that is, as a stable, continuous, and unchangeable, an intrinsic, innate, and inherent characteristic of its group. From birth, individuals were bestowed with a nationality, a language, a religion, and a value system, making ethnicity a fixed, objective endowment anchored to unchanging cultural traits. Behind this conception of ethnicity was a strong form of cultural determinism, which left little room for the subjective and situational aspect of identity. There is no construction of ethnicity here, just as there is no construction of race. They are biological and cultural facts. Both the commonalities and the differences between the two concepts are fairly clear. Neither race nor ethnicity in the early 20th century incarnation had any hint of constructivism. Instead, both posit deterministic hierarchies among people, founded in biology for race and culture, nationhood for ethnicity. With race, differences and hierarchies are seen as natural. With ethnicity, they have a primordial cultural foundation. Of course, the picture grows more complicated with European fascism, with their attempt to biologize what has been viewed as ethnic, primordial yet cultural differences in an attempt to naturalize them. Nazism and fascism is just an early example of the porous divide between race and ethnicity across their successive conceptual manifestations. I'll get to the study of the Greeks soon, but first some remarks on the immediate aftermath of World War II. A 1949 Paris UNESCO-sponsored conference aimed to reject Nazi-style scientific racism, leading to a 1950 statement which, under the stewardship of anthropologist Ashley Montagu, declared race a social myth and went for the phrase ethnic roots instead. The aim of the 1950 statement was to dismantle natural or biological notions of human hierarchy, emphasizing instead cultural foundations. Ethnicity fit the bill, despite its as yet unexamined primordialist underpinnings. However, this initial statement was not widely accepted, with many scholars, especially British and American, reluctant to abandon the concept of race as a natural category. Consequently, in a 1951 statement, backtracked, reintroducing a biological view of race and suggesting intelligent differentials between civilized and non-racial groups. Reminding ourselves of those years is instructive as we tackle scholarly work and his agreements. It problematized the notion that World War II was quite the immediate watershed it is sometimes made out to be. First, the initial move from race to ethnic groups in the 1950 statement did not in fact embrace a constructive view. It allowed for persistent differences among people as long as these weren't biologically based. Second, the failure of the first statement reveals the reluctance of the scientific community to repudiate notions of natural or biological differences altogether, despite the problem of Nazism and the Holocaust. At most, they were willing to state that this should not form the basis of discrimination, and this is what the 1951 statement stipulated. So I thought it useful to sketch roughly these wider coordinates because they provide a framework of some exemplary free and possible approaches to race. There is little need to dwell on pre-war German dates on race in the Greek world, from Bellow's notion of the centrality of race as the motor of prehistory and intersection with climatic and geographical determinism, through Uwe Karlsted's obvious remarks about the Athenians' alliance with the theory of Adiaten, whose racial impurity is betrayed by their effeminacy, all the way to Villamovit's addition to Nazism. And similar positions are found also in the best Italian scholarship. I'm thinking here, for example, of Gaetano Santi's anti-fascist, yet also colonialism, and capable of statements in which the racial superiority of the European was taken for granted. This is not describing the tactics of anyone along the line of what is sometimes done, just to stress the pervasiveness of such notions of race, which were common sense. If I can oversimplify further, race looms large not only in the scholars' ethic readings of Greek history. For them, the Greeks were immediately racist, and rightly so. Belloc, to give just an influential example, focuses precisely on those pervasive elements of Greek thought, denigration of barbarians, geographic and climatic determinisms, hierarchies of people, which are still at the center, for example, of Ivizol's 1991's Inventing the Barbarian, or Isaac's Invention of Racism in Classical Antiquity of 2004, and we'll get back to this. The evidence used by Belloc is more or less the same, and it is in fact read rather similarly, just with addition, and taken as it were for granted, at face value. On the other side of the Atlantic, Grace Hadley Beardsley, in her 1929 book, The Negro in Greek and Roman Civilization, mirror the same racial attitudes in the particular version that was prevalent in segregated America. Beardsley contended that black individuals in Greco-Roman times were subordinate to Caucasians, that's how she called the Greeks, drawing parallels to America's racial hierarchy. Her reconstruction, with self-satisfied analysis of what she terms tribal dances and grotesque representations of black people, was based on the assumption that racial segregation is a historical constant, a universal norm. This approach reflects an organic interpretation of history which assumes a direct link between ancient practices and modernity. Beardsley's work, similar to contemporary Italian and German scholarship, used a bidirectional justificatory approach. The ancient world is seen as paradigmatic and relevant because it appears to confirm contemporary beliefs and social structures, which in turn are justified by their supposed antiquity. In the reaction to this approach lies the first key shift I'll focus on today, so bear with me. Race-conscious or critical race theory influence approaches today take as their polemical target what is presented as a long-standing consensus, the idea that the ancients were not racist. This isn't a strawman argument. For years, the dominant view was that discussing racism, particularly anti-black racism, in ancient times was anachronistic, as antiquity was considered re-racial, lacking racial concepts. Recent race-critical studies have posited or assumed that this notion of a pre-racial antiquity is part of a larger narrative, a crypto-white supremacist or Eurocentric ones, which glorifies Western civilization and treats antiquity as its foundation. I am simplifying here, but not too much. Now, this might be the case with some end-of-history-inspired 1990s and early 2000s takes, and we shall talk of this pre-racial multi-ethnic Greece in a few minutes. However, the initial rejection of Beardsley's racial assumptions didn't come from self-satisfied proponents of antiquity as the foundation of Western civilization. Rather, it was two black scholars, Frank M. Snowden and Lloyd A. Thompson, who over a few decades and down to the late 1970s, challenged and dismantled Beardsley's views. Snowden, through many articles and major books, argued against the existence of racial prejudice in Greek and Roman antiquity. Similarly, Thompson, a bit later, found that while the Romans showed group biases and preferences for certain physical norms, labeling them as racist was inaccurate. This perspective became the prevailing orthodoxy, which still persists in certain circles despite the challenge of works such as Benjamin Isaac's 2004. invention of racism. It is, for instance, a position pursued in Mario Lentano's recent book, Classici alla Corno, I Romani, il razzismo e la cancel culture, which came out at the ago. What is going on there? Is it Beasley as representative of pre-war attitudes that saw the agents as admirably racist, that is the white supremacist here? I'd say so. Or is it rather Snowden and his epigons who absolve the agents of all racial sins and pushes close notion of a pre-racial antiquity? The reality is often more complex. Snowden's key argument was that antiquity, devoid of structural racism, could model a post-segregation America. His impact was significant. His work was a counterpoint to centuries of white scholars using antiquity to justify racial segregation and slavery, asserting instead antiquity as a model for racial equality. If Beasley used antiquity to justify and normalize racial segregation in her time, Snowden, while reaffirming antiquity's paradigmatic status, depicted it as alien, as better than a present that needed reform. This is a complexity that is worth remarking upon. Idealizing a sin-free antiquity doesn't solely stem from conservative, colonialist, orientalist, imperialist, or white supremacist perspectives. It often emerges from the left too, whether through a civil rights lens advocating for a pre-racial antiquity or a Marxist perspective promoting a pre-capitalist, pre-market antiquity. Despite this radical shift of orthodoxy, the underlying definition of race and racism remain roughly consistent from Bell and Beasley to Snowden. To find race, we need to identify the active enforcement of the deterministic nature of biology-based hierarchies among people. Beasley and Snowden were talking about the same thing, and so was confusedly also A.M. Irwin White in his Racial Prejudice in Imperial Rome of 1964. Somehow, in polemic with his own title, Sherwin White notes that it is commonplace to assert that the ancient world knew nothing of racial prejudice. If there was no racial prejudice, there certainly was some cultural prejudice. The question is, he goes on, how much, how deep? Throughout the subsequent chapters on Germans, Gauls, Greeks, and Jews, Sherwin White consistently prefers culture to race and often uses ethnic groups. Hardly ever he uses race, despite the title. Ultimately, the concept of race was discarded and found legal purchase not only in the study of classical antiquity, but across history and the humanities for decades. As Nino has written, one of the results of World War II was the final discrediting of the concept of race in the field of anthropology. The initial demand consisted in replacing racial difference with cultural difference, as Sherwin White did. It is worth stressing that race was not thoroughly examined as a term of art, but discredited and ultimately replaced once it had been established that it had no real relevance for antiquity. Ashley Montague lost his battle at UNESCO in 1949 and 50, but won the Dane scholarship eventually, and it was ethnicity which became the preferred concept, undergoing first a radical critical rethinking in a constructivist direction. The ethnicity that emerged from this shift was, however, almost unrecognizable compared to its pre-war connotation. Despite Nino again, abandoning biological race in favor of cultural ethnicity, unexpectedly brought scholars' attention the apparent paradox that the sense of ethnic distinctness of the actors did not map in a satisfactory way onto the cultural differences observed by researchers. Exploring these paradoxes led scholars eventually to settle on a model of ethnogenetics which we might term constructivist, in opposition to earlier primordial notions. This was the framework that has guided psychology on Greek ethnicity from the 80s onwards. So let's concentrate quickly on the distinctive features of this term. The revision of the concept of ethnicity after World War II was driven initially and primarily by the work of anthropologists Frederick Barr and medieval historian Anna Lenskos. With their work, the focus shifted from inherent differences to ascription and self-ascription as the key mechanisms for defining ethnic groups. Barr emphasized that ethnic groups are defined not by specific cultural features, but by the boundaries separating them from other groups. He argued that this ethnic identity is a form of social organization employing cultural differences to articulate boundaries, which are not necessarily dependent on the nature of these cultural differences. Ethnic groups are formed by mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion operating through ascription and self-ascription. Similarly, Benthus concluded that early Germanic peoples were products of ethnic fusion and fission with the term ethnogenesis. In these processes, cultural or biological relatedness was secondary to ethnic consciousness and self-ascription. The two approaches are complementary and they differ in dynamic of ethnicity that they prioritize to an extent. Benthus focused on internal aggregation, but was more interested in external opposition. Barth's work has at times been criticized as ahistorical and for not investigating how specific cultural traits become relevant to ethnic identities in different historical contexts. Yet this is also a strength. It highlights the arbitrariness of the criteria defining ethnic boundaries. What matters is constructing a boundary, not finding particular cultural traits to justify it. It is precisely in attempting to find such specific cultural traits that the work, for instance, of Anthony Smith on nationalism and ethnogenesis, popularized in Greek history by Jonathan Hall, also Smith developed a typology of typical ethnic features like shared stories, cultural norms, speech patterns, kinship, symbolic homelands. And while these are recurrent features of ethnogenesis, none seems to be necessary. Constructive self-ascription and ascription by others are the essential elements. The shift from race to ethnicity was then, in essence, a shift from various forms of essentialism and determinism to wide agreement on the constructed nature of ethnic identity. Key here is the scholarship of Jonathan Hall, Youval Malkin, and Mirko himself, who engaged explicitly with Barth, Benthus, and Smith in a series of seminal works. These scholars have shown that Greek ethnic identity was not defined by racial, linguistic, religious, or even cultural factors. Rather, as Hall put it was socially constructed and subjectively perceived. It is only with this scholarly way that Greek history finally abandoned, critically and reflexively, remnants of 19th century views of ethnic groups as static, monolithic entities with impermeable borders. Hall and Malkin address both synchronic and diachronic aspects, recognizing the dynamic, negotiable, contextually constructed nature of Greek ethnicity. Building on Smith's typology, Hall identifies links to territory and myths of origin as distinctive in the construction of ethnic identity for the Greeks. However, these are not understood as objective, but as collective memories of an ancestral homeland and a putative shared ancestry. Genealogies become tools for situating groups in space and time, reaffirming identity via eponymous ancestors. They are not static, but change within the group relations. Hall emphasizes the discursive rather than behavioral construction of Greek ethnicity, with myth of origin as key tools for self-definition and collective representation. Malkin's ancient reflections of Greek ethnicity re-examines the various constructions of Greek identity from the Iron Age to Pausanias. It underscores the subjective nature of ethnic identity, which resists attempts at definition based on objective elements. Primordial components, common past, homeland, ancestors, become identity markers only when groups over time attribute value to them. While Hall still seeks to identify core features of ethnicity, Malkin emphasizes the flexibility of ethnic indicators, fluidly manipulated by groups according to context and needs. For instance, archaic mythic genealogies align with aristocratic lineage, while oppositional identities constructed with reference to the Persian war align with emerging democracy. For Malkin, there are no fixed criteria, only flexible signs groups appropriate to construct ethnic narratives. This work has been groundbreaking for Greek history, but it has also shown some singular blind spots. This is my opinion, at least my provocation, as it were. In this literature, all Malkin, Vlachopoulos, slaves are conspicuously absent. Okay, perhaps not completely absent, but they are certainly central. This is less surprising for the archaic period, given the long feeling and orthodoxy of interdependent free labor rather than slavery was the key form of archaic exploitation. But the birth of Greek identity in the fifth century, seen by most as emerging from oppositional ethnogenesis in the context of the Persian War, would seem to scream for a discussion of, well, all the enslaved barbarians crowding the households not just of the elite Greeks, but also, as we know, of relatively poor free Greeks. That this is not for granted, the Persian invaders against whom Greek ethnicity is constructed are seldom associated with the notion of Persian subjects serving as slaves in Greek households, need some unpacking. All the more so, as this narrative on Greek ethnogenesis has emerged in dialogue with work influenced by Edward Said's Orientalism. Thus, the emergence of Greek ethnic identity in this tradition of scholarship, picked up in seminal studies by François Arthur and Youval, is characterized in terms of ethnocentrism and xenophobia. It is understood as emerging oppositionally, in line with Barth's model, to the construction of a barbarian other. Though sometimes there are mentions of slaves, the explanatory core of this work has to do with the Persian War. It is the experience of memory of the invaders that fuels ethnocentrism and xenophobia. Those are the barbarians being other, not those in one's culture. I'll show you one ancient source, the only exception to my promise not to throw sources at you today, to make the point that the association between Persian invaders and slave barbarians is not an assumption I am making, it is in the evidence. I think I've got the source cited in translation in page 2, point 6, there existed in Athens a law prohibiting hubris, arrogance, insult, against anybody, including slaves. To explain the reasons behind the law, why slaves who have no rights or dignity be protected by the law, a 4th century Demosthenic teacher introduces the barbarians as fictitious mythological, picturing their amazement at the protections the Athenians grant them, despite the many wrongs the Greeks have suffered from them and the ancestral and natural hostility towards them. Now, this clearly takes for granted that slaves were imported non-Greeks. This was not invariably true, but it was true for the most part. Most slaves attested are in fact non-Greeks. Aristotle similarly takes it for granted, and so does Euripides and many other sources. These widespread assumptions involve the ascription to slaves of an ethnicity quintessentially alien from that of the Greeks, and naturally aligned with slavery. They were barbarians, and they were slaves while barbarians. But the passage does more than this. It also shows that this understanding of the slave as barbarian was connected to narratives of the Greeks pitched against the barbarians in the Persian Wars. The law is surprising precisely because of the past wrongs committed by barbarians against Greeks, a transparent reference to military conflict with the Persian Wars at the forefront. The non-Greek slave victim of hubris was seen as one of them, one of those very barbarians the Greeks fought to defend their freedom. The underrepresentation of the slave barbarians in discussions of Greek ethnicity likely stems from the very focus on ethnogenesis and identity formation within this study. When analyzing local Greek ethnicity, the emphasis obviously rests on ordering neighboring groups, on war, international relations, imperialism. But even when the focus is a unified Greek identity goes through against the barbarians, the issue remains how and why the Greeks came to see themselves as such, not who they were oppressing or exploiting. I could add that when instead the focus is exploitation, as Ibn Khaldun in the ancient report of 1981, we find slaves aplenty, yet no interest in ethnic othering or racialization. The two fields have remained siloed and siloed, and attention to ethnicity was in fact understood as a move away from Marxist problems such as exploitation. This was the cultural turn after all. When we move from the more oppositional account of Greek modernity to the immensely popular shift in recent years to Mediterranean interconnectedness, towards a happy multi-ethnic and multicultural ancient Mediterranean, the blind spot becomes a gaping hole. Again, centering the Greek barbarian dichotomy, many studies have highlighted the Greeks' ethnographic curiosity, stressing how cultural content across the Mediterranean fostered mutual understanding and broke down easy opposition. This often protective literature very much downplays the centrality of slavery, treating slaves, when it acknowledges their presence, at most as vectors of cultural exchange and intermixing. But given the scale of the slave trade and the prevalence of barbarians among slaves, most contact with Greeks with no Greek must have been daily with slaves. Yet this is the one contact that either does not feature in this scholarship or is embellished as a form of virtuous cultural mediation. Blastopoulos' 2013 book, Greeks and Barbarians, is an example of this trend. The polemical target is explicitly those studies that overstress the oppositional and dichotomic nature of Greek-barbarian relations. These four key interaction contexts are, roughly, network settlements, Panhellenism, and empires. Absent, though, is somehow the others, with the many enslaved barbarians living and working within most Greek households. They do not get an institutional interaction context. When slaves do appear, as they do, it is mainly as a vehicle for the adoption of shared cult and shared beliefs. The whole is also more gaping, given that Blastopoulos is the author of very distinguished scholarship on ancient slavery, important articles, books, even an ERC project. So the likely solution to this riddle is the segregated nature of scholarly tradition concerning slavery and cultural interconnectedness, with their divergent questions and assumptions. I haven't said really anything about Nino's work, and I don't want to go on too much. Only one point I'll make. Nino's pioneering work on Peloponnesian and particularly Messenian ethnicity has been, by and large, very well received. Yet the one aspect that has encountered most resistance, not in Edinburgh, but you know what I mean, is his insistence that the Hellenes and the Messenians too were not a pre-existing Greek ethnic group turned into serfs by Spartan occupation. They were slaves coming from myriad sources whose Messenian identity emerged later. If this account of Messenian ethnogenesis is met with much approval, it believes that we are at least partially talking about slaves here too, who acquired Greek ethnicity through ascription and self-ascription, and proven instead unpalatable in certain quarters. And why? We can talk about it later, but I think silo tradition has something to do with it here. Now, throughout these scholarly developments, race and racism more or less appeared from Greek and Roman history, treated both as anachronistic and as heuristically and analytically irrelevant. Even Orientalism-inspired tales avoided the language of race, managing to speak of Greek ethnocentrism and xenophobia without challenging the orthodoxy of a pre-racial antiquity. This changed with Benjamin Isaac's The Invention of Racism in Classical Antiquity of 2004, a monumental work on 600 pages. And for our purposes, I'll just stick to categories and definitions. Despite its provocative title, Isaac's work in fact settles for the term proper racism to characterize ancient attitudes to indicate the existence of racism-like features in Greek and Roman law, distinct from modern laws. He meticulously analyzes a wide array of ancient texts, focusing on perceptions of skin color and naturalized and often biologized ethnic differences, which he considers indicators of proper racism. Interestingly, Isaac's book had significant overlaps with Maria Michela Sassi's 1988 book, La scienza dell'uomo nella Grecia antica, translated into English in 2001, around the same time as Isaac was publishing some of the preparatory articles for his big study. And yet Sassi never speaks of racism, of race and racism. So here is Isaac's definition of racism, and you have it in the handout, page 3, on point 7. An attitude towards individuals and groups of people which provides a direct and linear connection between physical and mental qualities. It therefore attributes to those individuals and groups of people collective traits, physical, mental, and moral, which are constant and unanswerable by human will because they are caused by hereditary factors or external influences such as climate or geography. Let's unpack this. First, we must stress that Isaac's definition is a constructivist one, along the lines of what has become standard in ethnicity studies, that posits is a standing for the notion of aspersion and brings home the fact that racism does not depend on actual differences between people. Those differences are constructed. Second, Isaac still draws a distinction between racism and other forms of prejudice. He does so by focusing on perceived links between physical and mental traits, reflecting biological previous conceptualizations of race and the ostensibly inherent and changing nature of such traits. Unlike ethnic prejudice, for Isaac, racism does not allow for the possibility of change at an individual or collective level in principle. In other forms of prejudice, the presumed group characteristics, he said, are not by definition held to be stable, unalterable, or imposed from the outside through physical factors, biology, climate, geography. Isaac's definition, which he applied previously, allows him to pinpoint something distinct from other forms of othering and prejudice, as studied in the previous 20 years or so. He has plenty to say about body types, skin colors, other body markers, and brings in cultural forms of othering that will overlap with those identified in ethnicity studies, only with the proviso that they can be shown to be treated by the agent as unalterable. Think of the long discussion of how we saw differences grounded in climate as ultimately ingrained and unaffected by geographical relocation. One perplexing aspect, to me at least, is the increasing focus on proper racism spurring imperialism, almost making that a prerequisite for there being proper racism at all. This leads him once again to downplay slavery's relevance. Slavery is there, to be sure, but does not seem to have any special salience in the attempt to cast other people as inferior or even subhuman than the others. These likely reflect a continued influence of ethnicity studies concerned with conflict between peoples rather than with exploitation on its approach. And his early article actually talked about ethnic prejudice. He then switched to that for the book. Accordingly, there is no attention to economic dynamics of exploitation anywhere in the book. Now, I had envisioned Isaac as an endpoint of sorts to my investigation, productively bridging ethnicity studies, constructivism, and traditional biological conception of race, complementing rather than supplanting approaches to ethnicity. He convincingly identifies a distinctly proto-racial form of prejudice. Isaac did not, of course, work in a vacuum. Medievalists like Robert Bartlett, Peter Biller, Stephen Epstein, and David Nirenberg, Susanna Barry, as well as Thomas Hand's special issue of the Journal of Medieval and Early Modern Science of 2001, all adopted in the same years a similar definition of strategy, understanding race as centered on bodily features such as skin color, physiognomy, blood, which are constructed as racial boundaries. Nirenberg subsequently put it as mirroring Isaac as all racisms are attempts to ground discriminations, whether social, economic, or religious, in biology and reproduction. All claim a congruence of cultural categories with natural ones. As it turns out, the refined conception of racism has, in fact, as I discovered, proved short-lived in classics and beyond. In the last decade, engagement with critical race theory has caused the definitions of race and racism to shift further emphasizing the constructed nature of race. Race is now seen as the product of racecraft, of the practices, strategies, and technologies which actively produce race as an object of knowledge. I'm talking about the Phil Sisters' famous book, Racecraft. Talking of racism as predicated on biological differences, even when recognized as with Isaac as constructed, seems already to concede too much to the existence of a reality of race. The differences behind racial concepts are ultimately irrelevant. The only legitimate object of study is racecraft itself, the processes through which they are conjured up and bounded. As Donald and Rotman argue, the issue is not how natural differences determine and justify group definition and interaction, but how racial logics are articulated and deployed, and with what consequences. The object of study should be, with Omi and Wyman, the social-historical processes by which racial categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed, rather than the racial categories themselves. And Isaac has, in fact, very little to say about these processes. how, why, in response to both needs and interests these races emerge. From this race critical perspective, this account is somewhat off-base. Let us look then, and that's my last point for this presentation, at critical race theories by categories and definitions, as they have emerged in ancient history in the last decade or so. From Susan Lake's race and citizen identity in classical Athens, through Denise Makovsky's race, antiquity, and geography, and Rebecca Tito Kennedy's several interventions, all the ways of their views on family blackness, definitions have emphasized the socially constructed nature of race as a tool of oppression and sidelined biological and bodily markers, embracing cultural ones as equally or for the ancient world more relevant. I have a few quotes in the handout. I will read only one aligned with the other. From Tito Kennedy, race is the institutionalization of prejudice and oppression based on moving signifiers for human difference, which can manifest differently in different times and places. These race-making manifest in institutions like laws and practices that create inclusion and exclusion, in groups and out. This approach is, of course, not limited to classics, but developed, worked out, and applied more extensively, for instance, in medieval history. I provide in the handout also Geraldine Hank's rather influential definition of the invention of race in the European Middle Ages, which has proven very influential also for the classicists that are starting to adopt this perspective. Now, it's easy to see that the clear extent to which that definition overlaps with concepts of ethnic identity and ethnogenesis in a way that Isaacs did not. The complete sidelining of the specific differences which are constructed reproduces uncannily Ball's insistence on the arbitrariness of the criterion underpinning ethnic boundaries. That this is the end point of both traditions is good news. It shows it's probably right. But it also begs the question, what are the historical gains in this much unfair shift in terminology? Some have implicitly or explicitly advocated, in fact, reverting to definitions of race more connected with bodily dynamics, as in Isaac, to preserve a difference with ethnicity and make the most of the heuristic gain of both categories and traditions. This is the position, for instance, we find in a recent essay by Nick and McQueen. Proponents of a critical race theory involved approach, of course, are not unaware of this problem and have provided their own solution. Sometimes the answer that little more than cascading yet more definitions, as in a game of musical chairs. For instance, Tito Kennedy proposed that we should alter identity by redefining it as self or other defined groups based on idea of shared cultural language or political affiliation that are not embedded within legally enforceable hierarchies of oppression. Right. So ethnic cleansing, ancient and modern, has no longer anything to do with ethnicity. And ethnicity can be invoked only when there is no asymmetry of power involved. Seems problematic as an assumption. Scholars like Mikowski, Derview, and Hank argue, on the other hand, for using race over ethnicity for moral rather than conceptual reasons. Mikowski views race as a means to highlight power dynamics and oppression, often sanitized in discussion of antiquity. If ethnicity, she said, implies a non-committal and flexible status, that's Derview's words, race uncovers unequal power paradigms. Speaking of ethnicity, therefore, raises whitewashing the oppressive history tied up with conceptualizations of group boundaries. Using ethnicity, then, I quote Derview again, is sidestepping the power differentials embedded into race. We can discuss the merits of such moral reason, and I, for one, do see some wisdom in them. But in history, the proof is, as it were, in the pudding. And I remain unconvinced that this shift, potentially productive, has in fact proven so far as productive as it could be. Ultimately, speaking of race rather than ethnicity, is meant to put into sharper focus power differentials and oppression, despite the fundamental interchangeability of the two concepts as they are defined today when it comes to identity construction and ascription. Fair enough, but as things stand now, new studies seem to me to have done little more than piggybacking previous work on ethnicity, changing the terminology and springing here and there emotionally charged language, yet without saying much that we did not know already. The proverbial bee in my bonnet is the topics which take center stage in recent studies of Greek fertilization. Why is it that in this new wave of Greek historical scholarship, the key example seems always invariably to be how the Athenians treated free residents, barbarians, and Greeks alike? Leif has written of race and Athenian citizenship, Uto Kennedy or immigrant women several times, Kazim is now on the perpetual immigrant, and so on. Because I would posit, this is what so many studies of ethnogenesis and Oriental discovery have been about for a long time. These are just recast in the language of race, with little heuristic gain, and in fact, I fear, some losses in clarity. Because if the focus on ethnogenesis and ethnic boundaries correctly identify that the actual target of certain ideological moves was not, in fact, those who were other, the issue lies instead in group dynamics of self-definition, inclusion, and exclusion vis-a-vis other members of the community. Now you see that the reason for which the Athenians developed an ideology of autonomy was to oppress and segregate immigrants. Historical explanation is hampered here, or rather prejudged because of the very model applied, and actual oppression assumed and imposed sometimes on recalcitrant evidence whenever one can point to an ethnic boundary. And most of all, why are enslaved barbarians not the centerpiece of the race-critical revival? Because they really are not. And when they feature, their racialization is diffused and dissolved into a confused mix of various, real or alleged, other oppression grounded in ethnic boundaries. And if the Greek determination to treat enslaved barbarians as subhuman and national slaves were the same or have the same root as the legal requirement the Athenians imposed on wealthy resident merchants to pay a measly resident tax. It's not the same thing. So, as I was sifting through much of this recent scholarship, one passage from Karen Field's famous essay, Slavery, Race, and Ideology in the United States of America, kept coming into my head. She wrote, probably a majority of American historians think of slavery in the United States as primarily a system of race relations, as though the chief business of slavery were the production of white supremacy, rather than the production of cotton, sugar, rice, and tobacco. One historian has gone so far as to call slavery the ultimate segregator. He does not ask why Europeans seeking the ultimate method of segregating Africans would go to the trouble and expense of transporting them across the ocean for that purpose, when they could have achieved the same and so much more simply by living with Africans in Africa. Paradoxical, but I think interesting. My impression is that something similar is happening with this new wave of studies of Greek racialization. They are still by and large bound to the interest and trend that characterize the study of Greek ethnicity, hence the non-centrality, continued non-centrality of slaves, and they are still fundamentally uninterested in economic dynamics of exploitation, just like capital basically were. They bring to the table a concern with segregation and oppression, sure, but these lack teeth very often and have their own dangers of explanatory confusion. They bring with them that is an assumption that segregation and oppression were both the end and the cost of Greek racial and ethnic boundary setting, wherever such boundaries are identified in a form of circular reasoning. Let's close on a more positive note, pro-positive at least note. If I were to start a research project on race in the Greek world, which I am very much not, but perhaps Nino will, I would start probably from this current field's photo. And I would note, for one, that notions of Greek identity and the racialization of barbarians do not match in time simply the event of the Persian War, but also what has now been identified as the demographic and economic explosion of the Greek world from around 550 onwards. These explosions opened up markets all over the Eastern Mediterranean, slave markets most prominently, affecting neighboring areas which were depleted and elevated as they became sources of slaves with more prosperous and dynamic ways slaves. I would note then that the Greeks started consistently to racialize barbarians as they multiplied in their own households, a stream of enslaved humanity from various regions of the Persian Empire. I would therefore text the link between racecraft and exploitation in the spirit, as it were, of Eric Williams' capitalism and slavery, and make the basic hypothesis assumption to be tested that the Greeks did not really acquire and rationalize slaves because they were racist and wanted to segregate them and oppress them. Rather, that they became racist because they started to have more and more slaves, whose exploitation they now needed to justify to themselves and to others. The picture that an investigation would paint may well not be pretty. We might discover that real ethnicity itself is to a considerable extent a function of pervasive slaveholding, but I think it would be worth pursuing nevertheless. Thank you.
Quite a good report, and I said opening for our discussion. Does anybody know?
Because of this.
Oh, you're right. I will forget how I voted by 19. I will open the discussion of the paper. Please, Father.
Thank you, Mirko. That was a brilliant paper, a great overview. And only I regret that I didn't hear it before, right? My author, I could have reacted from the sort of late critique perspective much better to the sort of propositions you have there. And I think it's also a very reasonable argument that could remind us that slavery was actually about economic interests. So far, so good, but of course, there's always a balance, and you integrate in your final sentence between identity and interest, and identity is not only about interest. Maybe I can push you a little more to elaborate on what you said in your sort of last remarks about that sort of facts. I mean, it's clear the argument is nobody would have gone to Africa to get slaves in order to feel superior to them. But then again, I mean, there's a lot of people in America nowadays who are racist, although they have no economic interest whatsoever in kind of employing or exploiting black people.
Yeah, no, that's very right and very true. Yeah, I mean, I think, okay, so my impression here is that ultimately what we should try to understand is there a very definite, distinctive historical process that happened at one point in the Greek world, one consequence of which was this pervasive racialization? I don't know, like a movement from the kind of world of orientalizing art and of Mazarino's kind of archaic world to this world of this binary opposition and so on. Like, I suspect there is a very big historical process there that, because of a lack of understanding of how the Greek economy worked, has been completely missed. And at the end of the day, I'm kind of reading through all this bibliography, and it happens to me often also with other content, no? I kind of, like, I got to a point in which I thought, I don't care if we call it ethnicity or race or Jimmy or Frank, but ultimately, it's the processual nature of the historical process that we need to kind of identify. So, like, I don't know if this is racism or ethnic boundary or whatever, but I do think there is something interesting to be said about the setting of a historical process that seemed to start when a massive economic change happened, exploitation started to happen. But then, of course, what I'm not setting up is not a new definition. So what I'm not saying that racism or whatever we want to call it, it's going to be only the kind of context in which, like, othering or certain boundary setting is connected to the dynamics of exploitation. All I'm saying is that we can identify historically a process that kicks up by that at that particular point. And then, like racism in America, then develop in a variety of ways and sense according to further historical processes, like all that kind of dynamic changes, for example, with the Wine and Mediterranean, with Alexander and stuff like that. So my point is not to deny that identity and cultural and ethnicity setting per se couldn't take a life of its own. But I do think that one big element that makes that historical process distinctive, and distinctively similar, I suspect, to the early birth of kind of that version of racism that is connected with the transit slave trade is precisely that. Is the fact that they both seem to emerge with certain form of ordering, which are biologized or whatever, and so on, in connection with an economic exclusion, an imbalance of economic power, and the need for exploitation, the need to be justified. And then that starts the process. And then the process we need to explain it, and it may well be that at another point, political factors become more prevalent than the economic one, and so on, no? And again, as I said, that doesn't particularly bother me because I'm a historian and I'm not in the business of definitions anyway. I'm more interested in kind of pinpointing the process. So that's basically what I wanted to say. But I do not certainly ever go to the extent of saying that we should concentrate only on those mechanisms of ordering, of boundary setting, or racism, or whatever that involve exploitation. No, but I think we should not be blind to those processes when they occur. Does that kind of answer your question? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for such a rich introduction and also analysis of the sources. I didn't think about it before, but listening to you, the difference between race and racism is more like they're tied up in modern period, and we are trying to see what the connection is in other periods. But something that I would like your view on is like another concept, which is like connected to those also in modern period, which is ideology, racism and ideology, and the place that racism plays, the place that racism plays in constructing ideology.
Yeah.
So what can we do about pre-modern society with this concept? Can we look for something equivalent? Do you think in your work?
Right. So, well, I mean, yeah, of course, like, I think you're completely right that basically the subtext is that what we're looking at is some kind of economic development, some kind of ideological development that is tied to economic and political development. So what we're talking about when we talk of race, we're talking about ideology. I think that's pretty clear, and that's Karen Field's argument. So you're asking, what does that do for us now, in a way? Is that the question? Like, how do we use that insight in dealing with racism now?
I'm asking if our question was to identify or to identify something that for features of racism in other periods will lead us necessarily to the big questions of ideologies in this period. So racism is like you said, it's connected to something, to a global cosmological conception. So what do we do with opinions?
Well, I think we can look at parallel. Perhaps if we start kind of taking into account these dynamics in the Greek world, then we may have been less kind of blindsided when we should notice similar things right now. Like, for instance, I mean, it is my impression, for example, that in much kind of discourse about race and ethnicity and so on, certainly in modern universities and there is a tendency to look at socioeconomic disadvantage and race disadvantage as kind of mutually excluded categories, or as if one could be an easy stand-in for the other in whatever direction and stuff like that, rather than look at them in interaction. And I don't know, I suspect there's something to be said there about looking at this more in terms of historical process rather than positioning. And I do think sometimes that the certain blind spot of scholarships on this issue that I'm identifying with the Greeks do match quite beautifully or worryingly with ideological blind spots that I see enacted in my institution or in our institutions and the like. I don't know. I was reading recently, but then I'll move to another project. I was reading recently Adolf Green's Jr., No Politics but Class Politics. No? And he makes a very interesting case about the fact that kind of the focus on diversity is more or less planted the focus on equality and basically allow for some kind of cozy kind of elite rainbow kind of multiculturalism, completely brackets out dynamics of exploitation and of economic disadvantage. And I think that stuff, when it comes to historical explanation, you see that. You see it in the way they talk about the Greeks. So I think if we get a bit more less blind this dynamic when we look at our work, and perhaps we can look at it also when we look at our daily dynamics. I think there are problems and blind spots that are in common in our way of thinking about these things. But that was hard to answer, and thank you very much.
Thank you, brilliant. I guess a practical question, where do you think, I think you're exactly right about where we should start from. Where do we look in the Greek sources? Where are we gonna, where do you think are the best kind of, what is the best starting point for working out what the Greeks thought and how pervasive their, whether such a thing as an ideology existed? Rachel.
Yeah, right. But I mean, I don't think this is a problem of programming different sources in a different way. I mean, I think the sources are all there. You can read a series of books and kind of know where it's at. I mean, you can read Isaac and so on, and you can read, I don't know, Versal about this chapter on the organic economy, and you put it together and you find everything you need. It's just that you don't drop from each other. That's the problem. I think that's a real problem with many fields. I mean, we've got all this new economic history, new Greek economic history, which I think is fundamentally correct and transformative, but without if I can speak with authority, we should kind of take it away from Stanford and Chicago and start looking kind of at dynamics of subalternity that are produced by the kind of model of a modern Greek economy. Like, for example, David is now writing about the Greek slave trade, which it sometimes felt like a shift back to over technical issues, but no, it's not. I mean, where did they come from? What were the effect on local populations? I mean, we got a wonderful kind of description by Xenophon of the slave trade under Suthis in Thracia, with then everybody, 1,000 slaves being brought to Corinthus, then getting a bad price. Corinthus, of course, was the main source of slave trade towards Athens. We got 1,000 people there. We see them marching through the territory. We see the whole dynamic of where these people came from. We've got inscription that gives us kind of a very, for example, I don't know, I mean, Isidorus household account for the confiscation. We got basically the entire Eastern Mediterranean represented in this guy's household. It's right there. This is not new sources. I'm started looking at yesterday. We know that theory. We're just not making it speak to the right questions, I think. So, yeah, no matter, we don't need to find new stones for this. We have all the stones we need.
Trying to know your opinion about the problem of the difference by race and barbarian. Very different. Because I think that the race is a little bit anachronistic in the discourse connected by the program boundary in the whole world. Another question is that at the center of a lot of discourse we have the problem of the humanity. The concept of humanity in the ancient world, I think that is very important to understand a different position, theory, and methodology to study very well the problem of marketing.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I was actually thinking about that. Recently, I was talking with a few colleagues about we were thinking about Remonti's book on anthropogenics.
Yeah,
you know very well. And I was kind of thinking that seems to work beautifully for a lot of slaveries, in which the justification of the exploitation of a slave seems to be grounded on defining the slave's lack of humanity.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in the Greek world, that's tricky, I think, because you have sometimes the distinct feeling that humanity per se does not come with a whole lot of dignity and rights. Dignity and rights are grounded on other statuses, which can be very generalized, like free, or an ethnic identity like Greek, or a role like being a citizen or stuff like that. And yeah, you can, so that's what brings you demand, what brings you honor in the sense of dignity and stuff like that. Being a human being, per se, before the Stoic and stuff like that, doesn't seem to bring you a whole lot of demand, which means that recognizing that the slave is human doesn't seem to do an awful lot for the slave. And that, I think, is fairly distinctive in a way. But at the same time, that makes it easier to order them enough to justify their utter inferiority and their suitability for enslavement on deterministic kind of geographical, physical attributes that very much neutral race, without having to go the whole way towards claiming these people are not human. Like, we talked about this, I think, when I came last time. I mean, I always find very interesting that the Greeks would say, like, slaves had no honor, had no demon, they had no rights whatsoever within the law. So if we decide to treat them nicely, as for example, Plato says we should and so on, we do that out of philanthropy. Which is fascinating because you could read that and say, okay, that implies though that they have a right to a certain level of nice treatment by being human beings. But that's not what the Stoics say. Let's say the Stoics say that philanthropia is precisely the kind of the sort of kind treatment you reserve to somebody that has no claim to a kind treatment. So I think that is an interesting shift. So in a way, I suspect, although I think this really deserves more investigation, that in racialized rather than racial justification of slavery in the Greek world, that's the one example perhaps in which the idea of like the definition of man and the anthropogenesis and so on break down. Precisely because they didn't put enough stock on being human per se for that to be the main thing. So that's how where I would go if I wanted to. But perhaps this is an answer like there's a question I have to answer by writing something else to kind of test the hypothesis. That's where I would go. Hello.
So I do realize that I'm in the minority here as an Egyptologist who works on documentary texts. But I do think something that is often lacking from discussions of racism, ethnicity, race, ethnic classification is the Egyptian idea of a pseudo-ethnic or a legal ethnic designation. People are called Persian or Persian of the, second generation Persian, third generation Persian, Babylonian, Alexandrian, Jew. Yeah. And these categories are not necessarily related to true ethnicity or ethnic origin, but are rather some kind of legal tax classifier. The fact that ethnicity is used at all as a legal classification is something that is really lacking in these discussions. And part of the problem, I think, is that when we discuss antiquity or classical antiquity, we kind of sideline Egypt a little bit, perhaps because it was its own beast in a lot of ways, and that's fine. But I wonder how these pseudo-ethnics fit into discussions of critical race theory, or the distinction between race and ethnicity. If you are calling someone a Persian who is not Persian, who may or may not be Egyptian, first of all, how are we to understand that in retrospect as historians who only have that? And second, how does it fit into discussions of ethnic classification?
Yeah, that's a very good. I mean, I think when I said that, I think like race critical perspectives could actually be way more productive with the way they're used. I think that's kind of the direction I was thinking about. I think like we do, for example, find in Egypt more than elsewhere. I mean, like I can't think of ethnic-based, or minute differential in ethnic-based legal classifications in the Greek laws. There's an in and out, and that can be a Greek and non-Greek, but they don't go further than that. Whereas Egypt, for a specific thing, it goes further than that. But that is not in itself a problem, because whether the ethnic is pseudo or not, the point is that as if we assume that the criteria for the boundary is anyway completely arbitrary, and the point is the ascription, is the race class. That's great. What that brings in, which I think we could do much better with that kind of example, is the weight of legal enforcement of this kind of stuff. And I think that's where we should go. But I think when we have gone there, for example, in some of the most unpowered studies, we misfired. We looked at the wrong places, at the wrong things. We had postulated legal levels of disqualification where there really was none, or there was very little and stuff like that. So what I'm also interested there in terms of construction and pseudo-ethnicity, you know, but that's just kind of an open point of interest, no, is how that ascription of a pseudo-ethnic in those contexts for legal purposes plays together, for example, with self-subscription of, for example, ethnics beyond any reasonableness. Like, for example, we can trace in Rodian funerary epigraphy people that keep saying that they come from Kos or for whatever. Like, and we can trace like 7 generations of these people. Like, after how long you stop being from Kos? Like, if you and what's the purpose of that? Where so how ascription plays out self-ascription, to what extent, for example, othering plays together with forms of pride and ethnic pride and stuff like that. You find that, for example, in funerary active epigraphy about slaves, where slaves sometimes seem to be very proud of the very same thing for which they are racialized and made fun of in comedy. And there's a wonderful passage of oh gosh, no, it's I think it's a discourse. Well, anyway, I'll double check. But it's a wonderful passage in which we have a Croatian guy that is very proud of how strong the Croatians are. And he said, evidence that our Croatians are so strong and so resistant and so on is that because we are so good, we get always chosen to work in the mill. Which was the worst punishment you can do to a slave and like the worst kind of slave occupation. And although that's kind of a comic thing, it kind of plays together with some stuff we find in our inscription in which people say, yeah, I'm very proud of these days and this makes me very good at my job, but the job is not a very good one. So I think that kind of stuff is interesting to explore. And like, yeah, I think you're completely right. That's what we should do. I'm not against race critical definitions and race critical approaches. I think that we can do better.
So what were the message of the events in the first one? Is that after the talk, one goes next door and a pretty coffee chatting. Oh, is that what?
No, your mic is not working.
Well, I just say that the coffee break is coming. No, I'm complicated. It's on this time, and some of you may have thought that the lunchtime indicated of the program and typically early for a static event. Of course, they were calculating on their schedule. We will resume at 11:30 after the suggested the call.
In particolare lo spazio perché ci sono tutte le armi, No,
No, aspettavo soltanto così. Ah, bene. Ah, sì.
No, perché l'altro per darti delle risposte terribili. Questo ha fatto male perché perché la gente aveva beh, a parte totalmente lento. No, ma anche noi che potevamo partire meno capire che eravamo come capire, no, ma potevamo fare il contrario. Mi rispetto la con l'università.
Deve distinguere come dire il valore linguistico dalla luce dal comporto del fatto per mai immaginare questa cosa la mettiamo in basso al storia. Io sì.
Quindi
E non fare cioè cercare una cosa che lasciamo alle origini per tenere la storia culturale, il trasporto nell'anale. E l'altra cosa che invece voglio fare è controllare, fatto parte dell'università di questa parte, andando of history of e due parti, no, è una cosa anche bella, l'ho campato, questo, i due parti da poi parte dalla storia dell'inglese e arriva qui in che volte la allora,
Sempre più convinto della mia idea, forse come sarebbe diverso
Ma sì. No, no, ma assolutamente. Oggi
l'occasione. Sì, salvi, parte
Sì, no,
Sì,
Allora, non dico da
I would say.
And Rotman, Professor Youval from the University. He came onto my radar for Ukraine. Le slave del lavaggio della Youval abbiamo pensiero from 2004. And if you wonder whether you could read that book, you clearly should, because the English translation was published by Harvard University Press, which tend to be rather selective. Professor Rotman is a could I call it by scientist? From my point of view, it's type of art. So I've been a close admirer of business studies for a very long time. He's a historian of the medieval Mediterranean. Slavery is one of his lines of inquiry, the one draw the attention, my attention to our project work. His most recent book, Slavery from the First Millennium, that appeared in 2021, very accessible online, for start to use, proposes a completely new way of looking at enslavement in pre-modern society, one that has a clear impact also on the way that we might look at slavery in modern society, that we're certainly taking unresolved, but it will take time for scholarship to digest all the new proposals that are embedded in the book. His paper today is called Origin, Religion, and Ethnicity by the Means of Exclusion and Inclusion of the Other.
Thank you very much, Mirko. Thank you for very kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here in Torino and be part of this day of study of very active and Yeah, Charles context. In this paper, I would like to examine in what way the origin of religion developed the rethink the nexus between slavery, ethnicity, and racism by reflecting on ways they played out in Byzantium in relation to slavery and mission. I would like to begin with the famous passage, which you're probably all familiar with, from Youval, an 11th century physician from Baghdad. His treatise, Introduction to the Art of Making Good Purchases of Slaves, combines both racism, slavery, misogyny, and objectification of women into what can be termed an economic ideology. So I quote, Indian women are meek and mild, but they rapidly fade away. They are excellent breeders of children. They have one advantage over other women. It is said on divorce, they become virgins again. The men are good house managers and experts in fine handicrafts, but they are apt to die from apoplexy at an early age. They are mostly brought from Kandahar. The women of Sindh are noted for slim waist and long hair. The women of Medina combine subtlety and grace with coquetry and humor. She is neither jealous, nor bad-tempered, nor quarrelsome. She makes an excellent songstress. The Meccan women, Monica, is delicate, has small ankles, and rich wit and language eyes. The Berber woman is unrivaled for breeding. Flying to a degree, she accommodates herself with every kind of work. According to the broker, Rotman, the ideal slave is a Berber girl who is exported out of the country at the age of 9, who spent 3 years at Medina and 3 years at Mecca, and at 16 comes from Mesopotamia, so Iraq, to be trained in elegant accomplishments. And that's when sold at 25, she unites with her fine original excellences, the coquetry of the Medina, the delicacy of the Meccan, and the culture of the Mesopotamian world. Another description, representative of Ibn Buklan's perspective, is the following. Berber women from Jazira Barbar, which lies between the west and the south, the skin is mostly black, but some of them are yellow. If you find among them a woman born from a mother belonging to a Kutama, Berber, and the father belonging to a Sanaja, while she has been raised among the Masmuda, you will find her to be naturally inclined to loyalty, to fulfilling all the tasks, and to working with zeal. These women are good for procreation and pleasure because they take good care of their children. So, as we learn, origin, ethnicity, color are cultural and ideological constructs used to create cultural distinction between humans. They provide justification to sustain and support system of segregation, domination, and slavery. In the time Ibn Buklan composed his treatise, The Central Middle Ages, we are not surprised to find such descriptions. The international map of human trafficking here behind me was vast and varied and extending from the Caucasus to the Sahel, from Frankia to the Persian Gulf. You can see in different colors the African slave traders from the sub-Saharan Africa to the markets of the Middle East. Is the Russian slave traders, the light is in blue, clear blue, and green Jewish slave traders, and in purple other slave traders. And the markets basically are the markets of the Caliphate, the Latin Caliphate in this period, and the Latin Caliphate, and also the Byzantine, is Constantinople, right there. It depended on the rich markets and elaborated economies of the Caliphate and Byzantium, who imported humans from countries peripheral to the Mediterranean, basically from Africa, and also from the Middle East. Some cultural and ideological constructs for racism were not new. Medieval societies inherited them from record antiquity, where they were used to justify colonization and subjugation. Benjamin Isaac, book that was mentioned before, has revealed in his monograph, The Invention of Racism in Classical Antiquity, the way Greeks and Romans deployed theoretical methods to categorize people according to their ethnic stereotypes. This was one of the ways in which the human mind dealt with the exploitation of its own kind by considering them as distinct foreigners, not as its own kind. To Isaac, this went hand in hand with the idea of the Roman Empire subjugating all other foreign people. The main point here is the identification of a group of people as foreigners, contributing individual qualities to origin, climate, and other common factors. In regard to that foreigners made them common qualities, whether inherited or acquired, and as we saw from the Islam description, the Berber girl can acquire good qualities by being trained in Mecca and Medina and Iraq. In his book, Purity of Transgressing Boundaries in the Eastern Mediterranean, 1000 to 1400, Stephen Epstein presents a somewhat different approach. He traces the application of physiognomic analysis, in particular of the eye, in late medieval Italy, and shows how it was applied to perceive differences and serve, therefore, as a means to create boundaries between people according to physiognomic qualities that function as categories. Yet, he draws a various picture on the ways people found to transgress such boundaries in their social relationship and economic organization. To put it thematically, the socioeconomic dynamics in the late medieval Mediterranean push people away from organizing their life according to the purity of categories. This raises a pertinent question. Do the socioeconomic circumstances determine the way we perceive the other and ourselves, or the other way around? The question was raised first by Eric Williams in his Capitalism and Slavery from 1944, who argued that racism was a product of the slavery system instead of the other way around. Racism gave a moralistic justification to the enslavement of Africans. 8 years later, Rodman Scott examined this question in his Race Youval, and later in his Race Toujours. Racism may be constructed according to circumstances, but it is always there, part of the human nature, human culture, actually. And yet Williams and Epstein's analysis challenge us to ask the main question in the heart of it all: under what circumstances people will apply it, and under what circumstances will they transgress it? Can we really tell? To examine this question, I argue, Byzantium during the century Middle Ages offers an ideal and truthful framework, precisely because it had no clear-cut definition of race, ethnicity, and origin. These concepts were applied in view of the ideological framework. After years of study of Byzantine sources, of all sorts and genre, I have never approached anything that could resemble even Muslim treaties. Naturally, Byzantine texts are full of stereotypes, prejudice, etc., but we will not find a systematic thesis to explain it, nor in the ideological framework it used. So how to begin? For this, the study of the way Byzantines refer to enslavement, the system of slavery in general, becomes coded. It presents a socioeconomic system in which the enslavement of foreigners by origin and religion serves as a touchstone without using it, so it seems, with a proto-racist justification. And here the map is very relevant because you can see that most of the states were foreigners who were important to the rich countries. In one follow, I will bring a few characteristic examples of the way origin, religion, and ethnicity were used in Byzantium in relation to slavery for both enslavement and manumission, and manumission is very important. I hope that this example will show that the Byzantine case is helpful for understanding of the complexity of the nexus between slavery, racism, and ethnicity. I would like to start with a marginal reference to slavery, ethnicity, and language made by the Emperor Constantine of Philogenitus in his 10th century manual on the organization of the empire, the Administrando Imperio, which the emperor prepared for the use of his son, the next emperor. It explains how to rule and how to fight foreign enemies. It contains an earlier treatise on the governance of the state and the various nations. The nation is ethnic, in which the emperor described the histories and characters of neighboring people, the Hungarians, the Peshmerga, the Rus, the Croats, the Serbs, Arabs, etc. The description of the Serb, the Serbi, opens as follows. Quote, the Serbs are descendants from the unbaptized Serbs, also called white, who live beyond Turkey in a place called by them Viki, Volgo, where their neighbor is Francia, as is also Great Croatia, the unbaptized, also called whites. In this place, then, these Serbs originally dwelt. But when two brothers succeeded their father in the rule of Serbia, one of them, taking one half of the fort, claimed the protection of Heraclius, the emperor of the Romans in the 7th century, who received him and gave him a place in the province of Thessaloniki to settle in, namely Serbia, which from that time has acquired this denomination. Serbs in the tongue, in the dialect of the Romans, is the word for slaves, duri or duri, whence the servula for many assured, while zebulanoid is used for those who wear jeans, footgear. This name the Serbs acquired from the being slaves of the emperor of the Romans. After some time, the same Serbs decided to be power to their own homes, and the emperor sent them off. But when they had crossed the river of Danube, they changed their minds and sent a request to the emperor Heraclius, for the military governor, then holding Belgrade, that he would grant them other land to settle in. And since that what is now Serbia and the so-called country of Zalumi and something else were under the domination of the emperor of the Romans, and since these countries have been made desolate by the Avars, for they have expelled from those part of Romans who now live in Dalmatia, therefore the emperor settled these same Serbs in this country, and they were subject to the emperor of the Roman, and the emperor brought elders from Rome and baptized them and taught them further to perform the works of piety and expounded to them the faith of the Christians. This description joins other descriptions of the people with whom exactly was involved. Its objective was mapping the international scene, and it contains geographical, historical, and in times also cultural data. In this, it resembles very much the descriptions of Arab geographers of the same period. As a general rule, the text is free of judgmental or moralistic perspective of common policy. It does, however, provide an important evidence about the vernacular Greek of the time. The Byzantines called themselves Turbi, that is slaves, because of the submission to the Byzantine emperor since the 7th century. This was both a political and religious submission caused by political circumstances, with no mention in regard to common qualities of the people in question. It predates the more famous case of the use of the Greek term sklavoni or sklavi, slaves, Slavs, as a generic term for slave for the 12th century. Another second important information regards the Byzantine naming of the Serb by the color white, Aspel, in reference to their land of origin, the unbaptized Great Croatia. The white color is thus attributed to the geographical but also a religious origin. And here we are provided with a glimpse into the complex Byzantine nomenclature of ethnicity. Religion, so it appears, or more so faith, had a role to play in this, in particular in regard to the difference between pagans and Christians. And this is by the use of another Greek term, Scythians. So the term Scythians continue to be used as a generic term to refer to a geographical origin of the northeastern hinterland of the empire. So basically the northern part of the Black Sea and what is now the north of the Balkan. The Byzantine recognizes so in terms of roots, Pecheneg, Serbs, and Bulgars. And yet they also use the term Scythians referring to these people. The term did not have an ethnic meaning, but a geographical, cultural, and political, historical meaning. Just in antiquity and late antiquity, those designated as Scythians were people from the Black Sea hinterland who were perceived as barbarians by the empire. To put it simply, they were the barbarians of Northeast. What was the meaning of Northeast is simple to understand. Barbarians was a different matter, and acquired a new meaning in this period, and two narratives from the same period exemplify the new use of the term. And here I refer to a geographical text from the 9th and 10th century, the life of San Tadeusz and the life of San Andrew the Fool. The first that come down to us is Slavonic translation, most probably a 9th century Greek original. I go between written journal, literary journal, and this is the intention because I would like us to reflect on the way different kinds of literary journal can shed light on the main questions that you want to situation. So the life of San Tadeusz recounts the story of the pagan slave at the time of Leo the Lawbreaker, so this pagan country. The slave is but the story is narrated and is written down a century later. The slave is baptized by his owner, then manumitted upon his death, and enters a monastery and leads a spiritual life, and the trajectory is prolonged and dispute with the emperor over items. That narrative is mostly used on the case of the Tadeusz the Confessor, who was the slave of Theodore Vitis. The Greek version that survived is found in the Synaxarion of Constantinople, which states that he was a Scythian slave of Theodore Vitis. The Synaxarion appears to be a central role in the struggle against the iconoclastic temple. In this version, the emperor tried to compel the saint to step on the cross, and when he refused, throw him to prison and torture. In the Slavonic translation, the saint fights against the emperor, in Leo, then endures torture. Composed a century later, the life of St. Andrew the Fool also narrates the Christian mission of a Scythian slave to become a fool for God. In both cases, Slavic slaves were chosen to Scythians, now from the same region, were chosen to drive the plot of two literary narratives, which are therefore called from the slave's point of view. And in both cases, the Christian mission that led them on the way to sainthood required their manumission. The use of the term Scythian in hagiographical sources in general is intentional and very telling. It refers to the barbarians in the northeast or the Balkans in Europe and Sea. Barbarians in the cultural concept, meaning here non-Christian. In Byzantium, it was attributed to the Russian, the Rus, the Russian themselves, and not to the Bulgars, though more relevant to the Bulgars. As in the life of Vlad of Pomorion and the life of Luke Dinamis. In both cases, there is an equivalence between being a Bulgar and being a Scythian. In all these cases, the Scythian slave refers to Slavic Bulgar fashionable slave who is non-Christian and is baptized by the Byzantine owner. And I quote from another geographical saying, the Scythians are not Christians. It is written by the author of spiritual beneficial text of Paul in the last 10th century. We may in fact understand this the other way around. These authors employ the term Scythian in order to designate slaves of Eastern European origin who are not Christian, and thus to avoid the categorization used by the Emperor Constantine Philogenetus in his ethnogeographic description. So what I'm suggesting is that this term actually allows the author to write something without referring to the ethnos or the ethnic origin, but to say religious cultural origin. Yeah, to put it bluntly, ethnicity in this text has a religious cultural aspect. While the term Bulgar in the 10th century clearly refers to Christian Bulgar, the term Christian does not, Scythian does not. So in order to portray the slave as a pagan who is baptized by his owner and then embarked on the Christian mission, the term Scythian proves indeed to be useful. In other words, in Byzantium, this term acquired a new meaning of the barbarian who becomes Christian. The question whether this person was Rus, Serb, Slav, or Bulgar has no relevance. In fact, we can even argue that the geographers did not use such ethnic origin for the same, precisely in order to emphasize how his conversion to Christian and the Roman, so Christian being the Roman, is the process of transformation of identity. A root could not become a Greek, but the Scythian could become Byzantine, that is Christian and Roman. In other words, the conversion of the Scythian was a process of, and here I use another term, national transformation. To portray, or if you want, proto-national, but I think that national fits here. To portray ethnic origin needed to be ignored in favor of the cultural origin of the pagan Scythian, could be transformed, while, Bulgar says, etc. The enslavement of Scythians meant also the conversion and the mission to which we should be returned. In more general terms, the Christianization of these peoples, both the root, went together, this period of the Christianization of the people, went together with a submission to Lia, this is the term the total use, to the Byzantine emperor, to the Greek church. But what about enslaved people who are not pagan? And here the example of Muslim Arab captives become relevant. In his book of ceremonies of the same Constantine Projectus, he refers to the case of Muslim Arab captives of the Byzantine state. So captives normally were also enslaved by those who captured them from the both sides, from the Caliphate and from Byzantium. Normally they would guard and keep them soldiers, this for exchange of prisoners of war, but there were other raids whose victims were sold and enslaved and so on. So, yes. He refers to the case of Muslim Arab captives of the Byzantine states and states that they could be manumitted if they convert, marry, and remain in Byzantine territories, especially in border regions. Their Rulia submission to the Byzantine emperor in the form of either fiscal or military obligation, being also fiscal. Regardless of whether they were married in the Caliphate, the two acts, their conversion to Christianity and their marriage to Byzantine women, transformed the Muslim captives into free Byzantines, a process which also made them trustworthy. And we have other evidence of this imperial evidence from the 10th century, ordering Greek women to marry foreigners when sent into Byzantium. And these were probably Muslim or including all Muslim Arab women. Such cases were reported also by the Arab side. Al-Masudi, for example, attested to the presence in 923 of 12,000 Christianized Arab horsemen among the Byzantine forces. Another story is recorded in Abu al-Faraj, Kitab al-Arani, a collection of songs from the time of Dalit al-Bashir. It is the story of the reciter of Quran, who after his voluntary exile arrived in Constantinople, converted to Christianity and married a Christian woman. But the most famous case is, for example, Yenis Akishi, the frontman of double race, the who was the son, this is the most famous Byzantine epic, who was the son of the Muslim emir and Christian Byzantine major. His father directed attacks against the civilian population of Asia Minor. Having fallen in love with the Byzantine maiden he had kidnapped, and under the influence of their brothers, he embraced the Christian faith and married them. The story attempts the role the Christian faith played in establishing, here again, national identity, especially in Byzantine Arab relations, and went hand in hand with Christian marriage, which was the motive for the eminent desertion. So I'm using that one because we don't have first of all because I think we should be appropriate. Second, because there is no other appropriate term to use here. Religious does not count, it's not covered, it doesn't cover the whole thing. Ethnicity, of course, you cannot use it. Political, yes, but political does not convey also the cultural, sort of cultural conversion. What we see here is a true concept of ethnicity. This is another way to think about it. The offspring born from this match is indeed considered the Pianist, so from two races, from two genera. But the conversion and marriage constitutes his father as free Roman, In other words, it provides him with a new national identity for which ethnicity was redundant. The Byzantines had many terms designated movements, so Arabs, Saracens, Hungarians, Mohammedans, Ismailites, which they use as ethnic, historical, religious, biblical concepts. Yet for the Byzantines, all of them designated people of nationality of the rival caliphate. And the use of nationality is not political entity because this term comprised what we categorize today as political, ethnic, and religious. Conversion and mission transformed them into free Romans or Byzantines, of whatever origin. In this way, Byzantium used ethnicity, origin, and religion in its realpolitik, facing its rivals in the caliphate on the one hand, and in Eastern Europe on the other hand. Muslims and Scythians were treated as non-Christians with the objective of the conversion and manumission. But what happened if they were already Christians? So a case in point is the novella 35 of the Emperor Alexius of the North from 1095, so 11th century, which is the end of the 11th century, which has two parts. The first part deals with enforcing Christian marriage as the only legal way to unite between slaves. The second part, which is very relevant for discussion, is dedicated to an acute problem in relation to enslavement of children born of free Volga parents who are either abducted or sold by their parents. It is very informative for a reason. The only Byzantine legislation, to my knowledge, that refers to a particular ethnic group in regard to slavery. The novella states that due to famine, Bulgar parents sell off their children into slavery. It also mentions Byzantines who abduct the children. The novella determines that anyone who can prove that he or she was born of free parents, so any Bulgar who can prove that he or she was born of free parents will receive the status of free and no one will prevent it. The novella attributes Bulgar children the same status as for other children born in the empire and thus protects them from being enslaved as a result of their parents' actions or as a result of actions taken by the Byzantines. Because so normally you could not enslave the free children of another parent. This is the process goes back to late antiquity, but you will find an extension for that, for that legislation by enforcing, applying it also in the case of Bulgar children. It was composed when Bulgaria, this is important, was not an independent state, but part of the Byzantine Empire. As foreign population, Bulgar children were not protected from abduction and slavery. Yet in the 11th century, the Bulgars were Christians. They thus required the protection from forced enslavement as well as the other inhabitants of the land. The fact that they were Christians meant that their legal status needed to be equated to the legal status of the free Byzantines. In particular, the legal status of freeborn children, but the protection of the law supported. We thus arrive at the inevitable question whether religion functioned in Byzantium was security ethnicity, at least as far as slavery is concerned. Namely, it was the religious quality by which a person was considered as one of us, that is Christian Greek, a foreigner who could become Byzantine through enslavement, conversion, manumission, or in the case of Muslim Arabs, through possession and conversion. If this is so, where can we find the moralistic justification for this type of conversion? In other words, going back to the question raised by Eric Williams in the before, if racism is deconstructed according to circumstances, what about circumstances in which ethnicity does not have a role to play? I would like to approach this question from two directions. First, I would like to show the moralistic justification for categorization between people according to their origin did exist in Byzantium, only existed in relation to the religious origin. And second, I would like to elaborate more on social and political circumstances of enslavement. What linked these two directions, the religious categorization of people on the one hand and the circumstances of enslavement in Byzantium on the other, was conversion. So what's between religion and ethnicity as origin? Conversion occupied a central place in Byzantine political culture. There was a difference between pagans who converted to Christianity and a heretic. Non-Orthodox Christians, as well as Jews and Muslims, were heretics within Byzantine political culture. So Islam was heresy as well as Judaism. Jewish residents of the empire and Catholic Muslims were natural targets for conversion to Orthodox Christianity. A considerable part of the long Byzantine conversion process was the abjuration of the converts' old religious principles, the anathema. So this applied only to heretics and not to pagans. The pagans did not need to abjure to anything. The ceremony was performed in church before the community of the faithful, and it disclosed the principles of the rival religion in front of the Christian community that accepted the new believer into its ranks, in public religion. The prayer book of the Great Church of Constantinople contains detailed descriptions of conversion processes for different types of heresies. The stages of the process are identical for everyone. This is for 2 weeks, the conversion candidate fast from learn to pray. At the end of this period, the priest brings the candidate to be baptized, and the candidate publicly declares having reached the Christian faith out of his or her with the will and love of God, love of Christ. Then the candidate espouse their original faith and repudiates its fundamental principles, laws, and forms of worship, as detailed in the formula of duration, devised for each and every faith. And this is a long formula. The ceremony concludes with the candidate declaring the Orthodox creed, to which the audience responds. The formula of abjuration listing the basic belief that the convert repudiates that offer more information on how Byzantine Christian culture represented its religious and political rivals. So I will just bring a short explanation, a short summary of the abjuration formula of destined for Muslim convert, who occupies 8-9 folios in Greek manuscript. So it's a very long text. A Muslim who converted to Christianity had to observe Muhammad, his hair, his wife, the Quran, the writing in history, the angel of the Quran, and the Quran's description of biblical figures, Jesus, creation, and power. The convert also observed predestination, jihad, and practices like the right of purification in stand. Along this, the anathema contains imaginary descriptions with no basis in reality. Thus, the description of paradise includes believers with 40-foot paladins who ascend to heavens and engage in adultery in the presence of God. The conversion candidate also has to repudiate invented religious practices, such as stoning Christians and worshipping the morning star and Aphrodite. The description of Islam is that implicitly it has comprised of authentic as well as imagined even demonic elements. Some of these later elements were written in what we call the text called anatopy, the Quran's refuting the Quran, anatopy, which was dated to the mid-9th century. But not all of the some of the fantasized description in the formula for observing Islam, like that of the Chamber of God and description of importance of what stars and constellations, seem to be based on it. At the same time, some of the descriptions do not appear in this world and are, what can say, invented, for this particular use. The Byzantines, in fact, were well acquainted with fundamental Muslim beliefs and practices. How then can we account for the imagined element in Byzantine description of Islam? And why do we find it specifically in a work on authenticity or authentic religious conversion depends, and that should therefore be closely possible to the principle of the faith. So this is the problem. It's especially when we need to be very accurate about the heresy that you observe. then you find the measure in the description. The description of Rotman is that idolaters and adulterers demonizes them and casts the right of faith as a contemptible enemy. It creates a moralistic justification for the act of conversion by stereotyping the rival religion as immoral, heretical, inferior. It establishes hierarchy based on religious beliefs and not the content. This may have functioned in parallel to the use of stereotypes preventing racism. But it is not racism or total racism, simply because the leaders can abandon its type of origin through conversion. A monotheistic society, as Byzantium was, needed a model for an inferior rival of a different faith and used it to justify its cultural hierarchy. But why didn't it develop such hierarchy? So the answer to my mind lays in the policy of conversion is part of the process during which the enslaved foreigner could be transformed into a businessman. I would like to invite you to reflect on the other side of slavery. My mission is the objective of slavery. And here I would like to refer to the Testament of slave owners from the 11th century. So now I'm approaching the same question from the other direction. First direction was how even time so religious conversion as something that can justify or build hierarchy. And the other direction is the use of slavery in non-mission. This would be my last point. I would like to refer to two testaments of slave owners from the 11th century. The first is the testament from 1049 of Gemma, widow of Byzantine Lord Dignitary of Apulia. The second document was drafted 10 years later by Yostatus Boilas and then belonging from Anatolia. So two testaments. And they are important because they give central role. They give many descriptions about slavery and about manipulated slavery. So the first testament of Gemma describes in detail the land property. The rural household is composed of several lands and houses inhabited and cultivated by king, enslaved, and manipulated persons. Being a sort of widow, without children, she leaves her land and houses to her four nephews. She also bequeaths houses, land, and cattle to two managed women, Risa and Maria, and to Iphigenia, whose status is not specified, and to three fighters, Nicephorus, Petrus, and Mama, who may be either freeborn, wage workers, or manipulated slaves. We know nothing about the origin of these 6 persons that are mentioned as heirs. Who were part of the household of God. And this is because they are mentioned by their Greek Christian names, which they got when baptized. But Risa and Luli, which are the slave person names, non-Greek origin. Gemma mentioned 3 more names without stating the statutes, who received modest land of. She also nominates the Master Church of Taranto to be one of her heirs. She ties the manipulated slave to the church by giving the church part of the property on which they live. Testament thus constructs a tripartite relationship between the family, the people, and the church. The manipulated slave all have part in the state and the socio-economic organization of the property. In fact, as the second testament further shows, they were all manipulated before the testament was drafted and were considered part of the extended family. So, the second testament is the landowner of 11 state, which is constructed and cultivated in southeast Anatolia. His main heirs are his 2 daughters, their families, and churches and families. His vast property qualifies him as a rich landowner. Along with his inheritance, he names 3 orphans whom he has raised and to whom he equates 2 of his estate. He named also 15 nominated slaves, he died, along with their families and children, whom he has manipulated in the past. He leaves parcels of land to all of them. Moreover, his testament includes a description of their individual lives and families. Just like Gemma, his household that comprises him, manipulated slaves, and orphans and their daughters. Moreover, his heirs also include 2 children constructed. His testament describes in detail the way in which he connected his manumitted slaves with churches. These two documents are characteristic of the way Byzantine Testament refers to slaves, or in fact, manumitted slaves, with no reference to the ethnic origin or any origin of that. We can use this in order to conclude the analysis. In contrast to the image we have of modern slavery, Byzantine slavery was aimed at extending the household, the order. It's a large socioeconomic organization through kinship and submission. Purchasing foreigners and converting them through baptism, a process that also created kinship between enslavers and enslaved, was not the entire picture. Most of the reference we have point to the fact that Byzantine slaves were manumitted, but remained attached to the household of their own family. Just one note on this also baptism. It's not the priest that baptized candidate, it's the parent, the godfather of the grandmother's mother, and that creates a kinship. And so through this we can see that the baptism was used to actually extend the family, enlarge the family by this type of religious kinship. The enslavement and manumission became, in other words, means of integration to enlarge the family. Of course, this meant that they remained submitted to the previous owner, and this is the meaning of the term doulos ruling that acquired in this period. The submission, the dulia, was the form of the inclusion as Byzantines. The objective was the creation of Byzantine. Enslavement, conversion, and mission served this objective. And for this, the ethnic origin was not relevant. The ethnic origin is ignored in all these texts in favor of a religious origin. This becomes the main identifier to differentiate between the Byzantines, so the Romans in their own world, and the barbarians, but also to turn the second into the first. The innovation, Christianity gave the Byzantines. When we do find ethnic origin mentioned, for example, in the novella regarding enslavement of women and children, it attests to the fact that it was not erased and was used in order to enslave also Christian foreign population, which Byzantine authorities attempted to do. Thank you.
First of all, Dr. Nelson, thank you for your talk. Second of all, can you hear me or do I need to be louder? Okay. I thought that your point about the selection for terms like Scythian in the literary sources because they are transformable, in which one can become converted and therefore become Greek because they're not national terminology is very well put. But I was thinking as you were speaking about the fact that sort of the opposite side of transformability is what Denise Ferrer de Silva calls obliteration. It's sort of forecasting a scenario in which if everybody accepts the true religion, then eventually they'll all become Greek and there will be no more Scythians. And I was wondering whether you could speak maybe to the question of the regionalization, therefore, of religious categories, saying, in an ideal scenario, Scythians wouldn't exist anymore, Muslims wouldn't exist anymore. Is that not sort of a racialized approach to religion? I get that you're trying to say that basically these were religious premises of category differentiation, but is there a racializing element to it?
So I think that's an excellent question. Thank you. I think that it can be found in more earlier texts in late antiquity about how you construct, how you portray the future, how you see the salvation of the world, etc. And then you do have ethnic features that come out. But I think in this period, Byzantium is already, settled in what it is. Doesn't, think about the future where everyone would be Christian and, their type of Christianity. So there were other, most of them they go. Conquest. So I think this speaks much better the geopolitical map. This type of, okay, we're not concentrating on the future, we're concentrating on the present. present and what we can do. And I think this is very pragmatic, practical approach instead of thinking, okay, we will all be, and I think that, they found other ways to hierarchize the society, which they didn't need ethnicity, they need other things. I mean, I don't think, after one situation, there was no categorization. I mean, of course, people were still remembered as descendants of slaves, but this was not based on the origin, but on other type of classification.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Rotman, for coming to speak with us today. My question relates to gender. Early on in your talk, you mentioned that captive or enslaved men could achieve integration within Byzantine society through marriage. So I would be curious to know who were these women and what status of slave were eligible to make such marriages. Because in the classical Roman world, with the exception of imperial slaves, it was very unusual for an enslaved man to marry a freeborn woman. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Also, excellent question. I think that she allowed me to elaborate more on the difference between Scythians and Muslims. Something that Muslim Catholics didn't enter here, they didn't speak about. I think that from one point of view, because we need to think about these two kind of fronts, the pagan and the Muslim, as two types of category of families that require different kind of treatment. And I cannot think about it. There is no law. There is no specific law about it. But I cannot think about an equivalent law, imperial law for Scythians or pagan slaves. They can, they would offer the possibility to convert, because their conversion was not the same conversion as the conversion of the Muslims. That is to say, for your answer, that the Muslim captives were treated or perceived as in some way equal. So the only thing that was lacking was the faith, which needed to be corrected. And that's what I didn't hear about, and I actually don't have much evidence, is on the Muslim women who also get captured with the Catholic. What about them? I really cannot answer because I don't have any evidence. So I think, and it's surprising to find this specific reference to this kind of regulation that even gives priority to Muslim captives who were converted. But if we look at the other side, on the story about the Quran and the Bible, you can understand, because he comes the Caliphate envoy finding like complete paragraph, and because he listened to participation from one of the three, and this guy tells me that he cannot, and he says that he came for Constantinople in order to redeem Muslim Catholics, and he could redeem them because the recital says that he's missing Islam very much, and also Quran is recited. So, and this guy says that he cannot, because he's now married and has a family. So you can see that the anchor is there. I mean, they needed this. If he was a slave of another person, so no problem. I mean, the envoy to the bottom. That's all. I mean, there is a mental conception also, which is also the family.
Just a couple of questions, and one is about the way in which, say, Islam is represented in the Byzantine source. You mentioned overall there is a sort of paganization of Muslim practices and beliefs in the sense that astral cults and the worship of stars and plasma. Say, may that have to do with actual practices of popular Islam that, for instance, you may find still to some extent in more recent times, for instance, in southern Mesopotamia and in Sabay and so on and so forth, or is that purely cultural and political construct taking place within Byzantine society? The second point is one on which I really have very few elements, but I'm thinking of the impact of Byzantine legislation through Egyptian Coptic, say, intermediaries, to say, on Ethiopian forms of slavery. There is Inspect and Guest, which is one of the fundamental texts on in fact, the rules of slavery in Ethiopian society, which is probably derived through, in fact, Coptic writing, which is, once again, strongly influenced, of course, by Byzantine texts. In that one, there is an explicit statement on conversion of enslaved pagans not being adequate for turning the slave into a free person, because they are considered to be instrumental versions. Say, I was wondering whether there was any source that you may think of within Byzantine practice or legislation that may justify that kind of exception to the notion of, say, conversion as a way to, say, exit the condition of slavery.
No, I think that fits very well with the Scythian paradigm, the Scythian example that they are pending. So, I mean, their submission, their enslavement goes with conversion, right? And later on, I mean, if they need to become part of the family or our family, then you know, the owner will manage it. Why? Because they are bought by private person. With the Muslim Catholic, it's different because they are bought captive by the state. So the state has this, you know, and the state thinks about, okay, how to create more soldiers, how to create more, how can this can be, what will be, especially in regions of conflict, and what do we do in order to convert them? And I think that this is always also relates to your first question. I mean, for them, it's important to portray the religion as like immoral. I don't know if, you know, I suspect it's like you, based on popular notion or cultural notion, I cannot prove it this time. There are other things that do not really certainly with Muslim, with Islamic principles in that period, which actually later found that there is some kind of, but this is for diplomatic issues, not at all this kind of description. So I think that you're right. There is a grain of truth in authenticity in this. However, I mean it's very important that the convert is forced to declare them publicly in front of the church in order to, you know, trying to some kind, I can speculate on using it as a means of, you know, self-conviction in the good faith regarding the work faith as immoral. So, but this is one. The other thing that we'll talk about is the language. I mean, the adoration formulas are in Greek. Okay, so for the Jews, for example, for the New Greek and all the other elements, okay, but Muslims have this, I mean, right. But they do, you know, there's no translator mentioned. So this is another thing. So whether it is like self-conviction or, but we know from other sources, including Arabic, that this phenomenon was, you know, part of imperial policy. So yes.
Is the time it's time to transition from the nourishment of the soul to the nourishment of the body? Okay, well, let's introduce the transition by thanking our speaker again.
Yeah. I guess it was much larger and the grand contract. Stay before things satisfied. So,
okay, as in the case of the break, the nerve